Written by u/Carl 1961. People think I'm a serial killer. It's far worse than that. Part 9. What the fuck are they? I asked him. I don't know. I already told you that. I don't know where they came from, either. I don't even know how long they've been here. Maybe they've always been here, living among us, preying upon us. He fell silent. Go on, I told him, tell me the rest. He shrugged. That's pretty much it, until I stumbled upon you last night. I sat there, absorbing everything he had just told me. I was floored. I hadn't suspected just how big this thing was, how far it reached. I tried to grasp the scope of it, the enormity of it and the implications. I asked him, how many of them do you think there are? I mean total. You mean in the world? Shit, I couldn't tell you. Well, make a guess. I pressed him, you know more about this than I do. Jeremy thought about it for a moment, then shrugged. Thousands, at least. Maybe even a couple million. I think we still outnumber them by a comfortable margin, for now, anyway. I was quiet for a while, mulling over it all. We have to do something, I said finally. Like what? Tell someone? Who do you want to tell? The police? The military? The government? They'd think we were nuts. No one can see these things but us. Nobody can help us, we're on our own. We can't be alone. There must be others like us, people who've had brain injuries and... He cut me off, speaking derisively. Maybe there are, but even then we're talking a handful of people at the most, scattered around the world. What? You want to start a resistance group? How the fuck are you gonna find them? You gonna hold a convention, put out ads? Have you experienced a head injury and can now see the soul-sucking monsters lurking among us? Join us for our first annual meeting. Are you going to provide refreshments? I've been dealing with this shit for 10 years and you're the only other person like me I've ever met. Frankly, I was convinced I was all alone before last night. The odds of the two of us meeting were probably 1 in a billion. It was just luck we happened to be in the right place at the right time last night. You probably stand a better chance of winning the lottery 10 times in a row before you come across someone else like me. He fell silent. Neither of us spoke for a while. I was lost in thought. Jeremy was right, assuming there were others like us who could see these things, we were too few and too far scattered to do each other any good, and had no way of finding each other. So what are we going to do? I asked him. We aren't going to do shit. You're going to have to figure out what you want to do about this on your own. I looked at him, confused. What the fuck are you talking about? I mean after tonight, you're not going to see me ever again. I'm going to stay out of your way and you're going to stay the fuck out of my mind. We're each going to do our own thing by ourselves. Wait a minute. I said, feeling alarmed, you can't just abandon me like this. We just met. You're the only one who knows what's going on. Hey, I don't know shit. I already told you everything I know. What the fuck did you think? We were going to team up together and fight the forces of darkness as a duo. You've been watching too much Supernatural. It's dangerous for us being together. How the fuck so? I demanded. Do you think those things are stupid? You think they're not aware that a few people are aware of their existence? They know someone's been picking them off one by one. They just don't know who. Every time I go after one I'm putting my ass on the line. Each time I don't know if I'm being led into a trap. We're a risk to each other if we stick together. I don't know anything about you, and you don't know anything about me. If we teamed up and they got one of us, they'd torture us to find out who the other is. Then we'd both be dead and who the fuck would be left to fight them? Not to mention if one of us got busted by the cops. Jeremy, I started. That's not my real name. I don't want you to know anything about me, and I don't want to know anything about you. I just wanted to meet you because I thought you had a right to know what the score was. I thought you deserved to know what was going on. I'll give you a little advice, just forget this whole goddamn thing. Ignore them, and try to live a normal life. Pretend it's not happening and you might be more happy. A haunted look came over his face. Frankly, I wish that's what I'd done right at the start. What good can two guys do fighting these things on their own? There's no way we'll ever be able to stop them. I'm leaving now. Don't follow me, and if you see me in the city, don't try to talk to me or approach me. I'll run. Stay the fuck away from me. He stood up from the bench and turned to leave. He threw me a final glance. Think about what I said. We weren't meant to know about this. There's a reason most people can't see them. We're freaks, you and I, for all we know. Those things might be part of the natural order. Good luck. He took off, jogging down the path, disappearing into the darkness. I never saw him again. It was nearly midnight before I returned to my apartment. I sat at the table, thinking about everything Jeremy had told me. I looked at my TV. I hadn't watched much TV since the headaches had gone away. I had been too busy lately dealing with work, and this nightmare I had gotten myself mixed up in. I remembered what he had said about watching the TV when I got back. I turned it on and watched. I changed the channels rapidly. I couldn't believe what I saw. There were so many of them. On the news and on talk shows and game shows and infomercials and commercials and TV series and movies. Shadow faces with glowing red eyes. And a lot of them were pretty famous. Movie stars and politicians and pro athletes and musicians. I won't name names, but you'd be shocked. Some of them had starred in the movies I had seen at the hospital after I had recovered from my surgery. Some of them were the film sex goddesses I had found myself lusting after. Now that I could see their true appearance, I felt repulsed. An alarming possibility occurred to me. I switched back to the news. They were covering the upcoming presidential election. The president was speaking at a campaign rally. To my immense relief, he was not a shadow face. My relief was short-lived when after the rally was over, they cut to footage of his opponent, some blue-blooded wasp asshole who had a reputation for being both a sneering elitist and a religious fundamentalist, who was distinctly not human. I felt my stomach turn over. God help us if that thing won the election. Thankfully, a few weeks later, it lost, but it was a close call. This raised another thought. I got out my laptop and began doing some research. I knew now that I could detect those things on TV, but would my brain be able to register them in photographs? I began checking out old photographs of famous historical figures going back to the beginning of commercial photography in the mid-1800s. Once again, I was blown away by what I found. They had been around for a long time, at least 150 years. Several former U.S. presidents, world leaders, rulers, noblemen and royalty, along with celebrities from the 20th century, all now long deceased, had been shadow faces. Some rather infamous ones included Lyndon Johnson, Governor George Wallace, Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, and Pol Pot. It wasn't just political figures or movie stars who had been shadow faces, either. Several notorious terrorists, criminals and serial killers, including Charles Manson, also hadn't been human. I closed my laptop, my hands shaking a little. Christ, how far back did this thing reach? How far down did the rabbit hole lead? And what the fuck was I going to do about it? I had a sudden brainstorm. An epiphany. I jerked back in my chair as if I had been shocked, wondering why I hadn't thought of it sooner. Dr. Steiner. The man who had performed the procedure on me that had been the cause of all this. I knew he was human because I had seen him after the onset of the crippling migraines that had signaled the start of my second sight, or whatever you wanted to call it. I hadn't spoken to him in a few weeks, ever since he had run a CAT scan on me to try to discover the source of my headaches, but I had his number. It had been 6 months since my surgery, and I suddenly found myself wondering if he had performed the same procedure on anyone else since then, other people who might be able to see them like Jeremy and I could. I had to speak to him. Now. I dialed his number, but it went straight to voicemail. It was going on 2 in the morning by then, so I figured he was probably asleep. I left him a message explaining who it was and that I needed to speak with him urgently, as soon as possible, then hung up. I went to bed and after an eternity, I finally managed to drift off to sleep, determined to call him again in the morning and find out if there were any other patients who had undergone the same surgery I had and had reported the same strange migraines I had experienced. I didn't wake up till close to noon because I had been up so late the night before. I had to be at work soon, and didn't have time to call Dr. Steiner. I cursed myself for sleeping in as I raced to get dressed for my shift, leaving my apartment knowing I wouldn't be able to call him until I got off this evening. I checked my phone on the drive to the supermarket but there were no new calls or messages. Dr. Steiner hadn't called me back. I figured he was too busy. My shift seemed to drag by, moving at a glacial pace. I didn't think it would ever end. I was on autopilot the whole time, not really paying attention to anyone or anything. My co-workers and friends noticed how distracted and agitated I seemed and expressed concern. I told them I was still recovering from the bug I had the last few days. An eternity later, I punched out and drove home, forcing myself not to speed. I sprinted to my apartment and the first thing I did was dial Dr. Steiner's number. Again, it went straight to voicemail. Frustrated, I threw my phone down and got on the internet, doing a search for him online to see if there was a different way I could contact him. I didn't have to search for long before I found something. A news article dated only a week before. I read it, feeling a sinking sensation in my stomach. A feeling of utter hopelessness. I groaned in despair and lowered my head. The article's headline read, "Prominent neurosurgeon Carl Steiner, 67, dead in car accident." I read the article. Dr. Steiner had been driving home from the medical school campus one evening and the brakes of his car had failed as he was stopping at an intersection. He had slid through and been T-boned by a semi, dying instantly. The other driver had survived with only minor injuries. It seemed a little too neat. A little too convenient. I wondered if there was more to it. Dr. Steiner had been onto something with his radical new procedure that could restore sight in those who had experienced trauma to their occipital lobe. Maybe those things had caught on and been worried, viewing him and his medical breakthrough as a threat. Maybe they had decided to take him out of the picture. I remembered the first shadow face I had seen, that pretty blonde student jogging on the campus on that long ago day last spring. I wondered if she had been one of Dr. Steiner's students. Some of you have probably been wondering if perhaps Dr. Steiner had known more than he was letting on, if perhaps he had been aware of these creatures and that his surgery would enable people to see them. Truthfully, I don't think he was. Nor do I think he had any ulterior motives for wanting to restore my sight. I think he was as unaware as I was that his surgery would activate some part of the brain that normally lies dormant, unlocking some hidden sixth sense. After all, Jeremy hadn't needed Dr. Steiner's surgery in order to be able to see them. It had been completely unintentional, a random accident. I sat there in front of my laptop, feeling my last avenue of hope slamming shut before me. I realized I was truly alone. Dr. Steiner was dead and Jeremy had told me not to try to reach him. These things were all over the world, some in positions of high power and influence. There was nothing I could do about it. I considered my options. I knew I was not a cold-blooded killer. What had happened the other night had not been premeditated. I had acted purely in my own defense. Despite what Jeremy had told me, what these things were up to, I knew couldn't accept the lifestyle he had chosen and become some supernatural vigilante. I remembered him telling me that maybe I should just forget about the whole thing and try to ignore it, try to live a normal life and pretend it wasn't happening. And for a while that's exactly what I did. I went to work and tried to enjoy an average, carefree life. I hung out with my friends, indulging in my social life, drinking with the guys, going to movies with them, trying to ignore the shadow-faced travesties masquerading as humanity that seemed to leap out at me, towering over me from the 30-foot screen, and even dated Nikki, the cute cashier I had a crush on. This went on for several weeks, as October became November and fall inched closer to winter, the weather gradually getting colder. Several times I encountered shadow faces, mostly in public, but on a couple occasions they entered the supermarket. I bagged their groceries nonchalantly, pretending I couldn't see their faceless black voids, couldn't feel their red eyes upon me like lasers. I actually became rather casual, even bored with the whole phenomenon. For all I knew they were just trying to live their own lives, getting by in the world the same as us. Maybe sucking souls or life forces, or whatever they were stealing was just something they had to do in order to survive. I told myself it wasn't my problem, it didn't concern me. This probably sounds callous, even heartless, but I told myself it wasn't like they were killing anyone who mattered, anyway. Just the dregs of society, the cast-offs, no one anyone cared about. Again, that sounds heartless, but that's just how I tried to rationalize my inaction, how I tried to justify my cowardice. Then, in late November, just before Thanksgiving, I was sitting in the employee break room eating my lunch, watching TV. The news was on. A picture of a cute, smiling 9-year-old girl with heartbreakingly innocent eyes. She had been sleeping over at her friend's suburban home and had died from what the medical examiner had diagnosed as a brain aneurysm. The previous evening, her tearful, grieving parents were interviewed. She was my little angel, the sweetest, nicest person you could ever hope to meet, her mother sobbed. Then it cut to the girl's friend, the one whose house she had been sleeping over at. I thought she was having a heart attack. I tried to save her by performing CPR like they taught us at school, the friend wailed inconsolably. She sounded like she was in tears, but I couldn't see any in her hellishly burning red eyes or on the darkness covering her face. I got up and went to the restroom. I sat on the toilet, my head lowered into my hands, my eyes closed, for 10 minutes. Against the darkness of my eyelids, the darkness I knew so well, I could see the girl's sobbing, bereaved mother. In my mind's eye, her face seemed to accuse me. When I got up from the toilet, I went to the mirror and stared at myself. There was a look of grim resolve on my face. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't run from it anymore, couldn't pretend it wasn't happening. Gun laws are pretty strict in the city where I lived, But one of supermarket employees, a Mexican guy named Carlos who worked unloading trucks in the loading docks, was a pretty intense-looking dude with a sketchy past and a lot of old gang tattoos on his arms. I approached him in private and asked if he could help me get a gun for home defense. He was pretty suspicious at first, probably thinking I was trying to set him up for a bust, but after I convinced him I was on the up and up, he hooked me up with an old associate of his, whose number I called that same evening to arrange a meeting. 3 nights later, I met Carlos' old associate behind a Dunkin' Donuts closed for the night. He made me lift my shirt to make sure I wasn't wired, then lead me to the back of his restored, pristine Plymouth Barracuda and lifted the trunk, displaying a wide and impressive array of firepower, from basic handguns to fully automatic, and unquestionably illegal, heavy-caliber assault weapons. He showed me several guns, explaining how to load and operate them, telling me their various merits, etc. I finally settled on a Ruger Red Hawk .357 Magnum revolver with a snub-nosed barrel and 8-shot capacity. I paid him $600 in cash, and he chipped in 2 boxes of hollow point ammunition for free. The next night I fashioned a crude silencer out of an 8-inch length CPVC pipe and some spray and foam insulation, using a tutorial I found on YouTube. On my next night out, in early December, I left my apartment, wearing an overcoat I had bought at a thrift store with pockets deep enough to contain my gun and silencer, and began my first hunt. I walked the mostly deserted, nighttime city streets for over 2 hours, looking at everyone I passed by. Then I spotted her coming out of a nightclub. At first glance she appeared to be your typical spoiled little rich airhead who idolized Kim Kardashian and Paris Hilton and probably threw a temper tantrum when daddy got her the wrong colored BMW for her sweet 16th. A vacuous, living Barbie doll with peroxide hair and so many Botox treatments it was hard to place her age. She could have been 23 or 35. She was wearing a designer trench coat over a short denim skirt and a white t-shirt that said Princess in pink cursive writing. Her breasts were too large for her small frame to be anything other than implants. She exited the nightclub in the company of 2 other young overly pampered rich bimbos. They said their goodbyes before parting ways. Her face rippled, then transformed into that of a shadow face. I followed her down the sidewalk, keeping my distance. I saw her turn down an alley. I looked around, saw no one, and removed the .357 Magnum, attaching the makeshift silencer, then entered the alley after her. She was crouched over a 50-ish, unshaven homeless man passed out against a brick wall, an empty bottle of cheap whiskey close at hand. She was leaning forward toward his face as if to kiss him. "Hey," I said softly, conversationally. She spun towards me, her piercing red eyes burning in the blackness of her face like twin fires in the pit of hell. "Who the fuck are you?" she demanded shrilly. I didn't answer her or make some witty pre-mortem one-liner like Schwarzenegger or Willis. I just raised the .357 and fired 3 times, the muffled reports sounding like someone coughing into their fist. Her brain splattered onto the littered pavement behind her and she crumpled to the ground without a sound, her face reverting back to normal, a wide-eyed look of surprise fixed upon it, 3 bullet holes in her cheeks and forehead. The homeless man stirred and muttered unintelligibly in his alcohol-induced slumber. He was still alive. I shoved the silenced revolver back into my overcoat pocket and fled the alley, pausing just long enough to grab the expensive handbag the shadow-faced woman had carried with her. I removed her wallet and phone, wiped the handbag clean of fingerprints, and threw it in a dumpster 4 blocks away, covering it with trash. I removed the cash from her wallet, then dropped it and her phone down a storm drain. That was the first one I hunted down.